Hello, it's time for us to get going again with our learning of how to build a web app. All right, so recall that we last talked about this model of you got a browser, it sends in an HTTP request, our web server gets that request, sends it to Rails. Based upon what that request is, we decide to run some code. That code then talks to our database. We get results back from our database. Our code then processes it, turns it into HTML. That HTML goes back as an HTTP response to the browser, which the browser then reads that HTML code and makes a nice pretty page for us. All right, so this HTTP request, what should we be thinking about with it? I mean, from at the moment, what all I want you to do is think about is the fact that, yes, I have some URL and I want to get that URL because you're used to that. You know, you type that URL into your browser and you hit submit and you're trying to go get whatever's there. Go to that page, go to that website, whatever it is. So let's talk about these URLs. So URLs are uniform resource locators. There's also this whole big thing about a URI, uniform resource identifier, and I guess there are URNs as well. The reality is all of these things with HTTP or HTTPS, we call them URLs. I'm going to call them a URL so that we don't go insane. I'm not going to start saying URI. I think URI is a more general situation. I've tried to look it up and understand it. These are URLs. All right. They're also URIs because URIs is more general. Anyways, this tells us what our protocol is. So you could end up with, you might see FTP, file transfer protocol. You might even see something else there. The most common one is to also have it be, and you're largely almost always getting supplanted with HTTPS. So Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. That's what the S is. The S stands for secure. Everything in the early days was done over unsecure communication channels, which means your requests over the internet went in a data format that anyone, if they were able to listen in on that communication, would know exactly what you sent to the web server and was received from the web server. You might be shocked to think that we operated in that fashion, but we absolutely did. And indeed, email has traditionally always been sent around unencrypted. Email has been treated like a postcard. Okay, so you put a postcard in the mail and an unethical postal employee can take your postcard and read about whatever you write on it because it's there, it's visible. And so email has always had a security level that's basically at the level of postcards. This is why you don't send private financial information and things in email. It's not secure. Anyways, so we can do secure stuff over the web if we're using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol with S, secure. Otherwise, just plain HTTP is not secure. All right. Now, you give these two slashes, and you give some sort of site, let's say .com. This is what we call our host name. All right. The whole point about this is for your browser to go and using the powers of domain name services and things to say, I've got this string here. Could you please give me back a IP address? That's a numeric address for networking so that I can actually reach whoever that is. So basically it's like, I've got this string. Could you please turn it into the equivalent of a numeric phone number for me, please, so that I can actually dial that person? But anyway, this is where you're going to connect on the internet, basically making like your phone call. And so whatever that web server is, it lives at that address. So that's where we're going to do the request to. Now, then you very rarely will have seen this. Something like colon 3000. And what in the world is this? Well, this says, please, when you connect to here, use the following port. All right, the default port for HTTP is port 80, and the default port for HTTPS is 443. All right, so what's a port? Well, these servers, your computer, can have multiple connections at once. All right, so this is kind of like when you call the university and there are extensions. All right, and so there's one number for the university, and then they say, which extension would you like me to connect you to? This is like saying, please connect me to extension 3000. All right, so the default is 80. Where are we going to see 3000? 3000 is when we do development. So the default for Rails for development work is port 3000. Don't worry about it. We'll tell you how to set everything up, and then you won't notice or think twice about this. Nevertheless, so there can be part of that as part of the putting this together. Then comes the great part. You might have something like list/display ? And then you're going to see something like, Q equals foo and P equals goo. I don't know. All right. So this whole part here, from basically the slash to before the question mark, this is what we call our resource path. All right. Now, so you've been spending time in the Unix terminal learning about the Unix file system. And the Unix file system starts with a slash at the root, and then you've got a directory name and a slash and another directory name on down till you eventually get to a file or whatever. It's not a coincidence that they are the same. Unix was born and bred, the web was born and bred on Unix machines. And originally, before we had all this really cool notions of we're running code here and we're talking to databases and we got all this interactive stuff for you, all the early websites had as their web server something that basically the request would come in and it would say, oh, okay, you want this. And there would be somewhere on the file system here that we would say, this is our web root. Not the root of our file system, but this is for the files that I want to make available on my website. And so this would map directly to the file system in a location. And in that file system, you'd have a directory called list, and then another, let's say a file named display, and maybe it was actually display.html, And the idea is the web server actually was acting a lot like a file server. It would go and it would go down and it would read whatever that file was and just send that HTML back to the browser so that you could view it. And the HTML has links in it, which would allow you to click and make a new request for a new file or to go to another site on the internet. All right. I haven't mentioned this, hypertext. Where the heck is hypertext? Hypertext is this whole idea that you've got pages and it has links that you can click that take you to other pages. That's hypertext in the short version of it, all right? So if you've got something you can click and go to other links, go to other pages, hypertext. All right, so that's why the resource path it looks like a file path, because originally it was always used as a file path. What we're going to see now when we get into the depths of Rails is that we're going to use this. We're going to maintain format similar to this, but we're going to use that as a way to say, oh, what code do you want me to run? What sort of function are you requesting me to do for you? So it turns more into a function call notion rather than a please fetch this file. Okay, so originally was, go back to 1994, 95, before you were likely born. And yes, it was please fetch me this file. It has since evolved to be much more akin to, oh, here it's like making a function call on the server. Please run this, please do this thing for me. Whatever, I don't know how you implement it, but please get me the latest weather forecast. And oh, I got to go look everything up and so forth and so on. It's not go read me that file on your file server that says it's the most recent weather forecast and send it back. It's a dynamic thing that's done. So it's more like a function call or a method call nowadays. And we have to interpret what that means when we are in Rails to determine what actual piece of code we want to run. That's called routing. Okay, so we'll eventually send this into and deal with the notion of a route. Okay, now this final little bit here is known as the query string. Traditionally, because you're going to see queries run like on a web search engine. So if you go to Google right now, type in a query, and you'll notice you've got this sort of stuff. You've got a resource path, and then you've got a question mark, and you should see embedded in that the words that you have typed along with some other stuff thrown in there. And what this format is it's set up so that you have a name equals some value, and then an ampersand separates the name value pairs. All right. So you can have this long string of name value pairs. And again, the idea is that when the request comes through and ends up in the web server, we're going to say, oh yeah, I've got this resource path. That tells me I'm going to route that to a particular piece of code that will run. Now that piece of code can go, oh, by the way, did you happen to have any query parameters for me on your query string? Oh, yes. And this can get turned very nicely into a hash. Again, so we've got these names going to values so that we can look up and find out what they were. And imagine you're writing a search engine. And so you'd go, oh, this is the code I'm going to run, which is to run this function. Great, but I need to know what the user wanted to search for. Okay, go look at the query string. Ah, okay, great. Now I know what to do. And that's like the basic notion of a URL spelled out with all its parts. So this tells us how to talk. What protocol, what language should we be talking back and forth to do our communication? This is basically, which phone number to call. This is which extension. Then, once we make our connection, this information plus this information here is used to route. We're going to use it to figure out what code to run on our side. And then that might come in. We might use it. In general, you're going to see that we very rarely use these query strings, but we can use them. And we might use that as some of the input to help us understand what our code should actually do and return back to the user's browser. So now that I've broken that down, I'll take a pause and I'll start up a new video.